So we have been talking about, over the centuries and years, how the one book that we call the Bible had been assembled from all of the different books and the different writings that make up the Old and New Testaments. Tonight and next week, we're going to talk about different translations of those testaments. Ones that we read, ones that other people read, ones that came before, new and old translations as well. So, to start off, I want to hear what some of your favorite, enjoyed Bible translations are to use and read. Shout them out.
NIV.
NIV, very good. Yep.
NRSV.
NRSV, yep.
King James.
King James, sure.
I also like Peterson.
What's that?
I also like Peterson.
The Message?
The Message.
Yeah. That's the one Marshall always reads from when Marsh reads. What'd you say, Annette?
Common English Bible.
Common English Bible? I'm using abbreviations because they're quicker to write, obviously.
NASB.
In ASB, the New American Standard Bible. And this was the New International Version, the New Revised Standard Version. Other ones?
I have a NIV, but Life Application Bible that's been studied.
Good. What kind of extra things and study helps does it have?
Well, it has commentaries with all the scripture, and then, I'm sorry to say some other things I haven't really studied like I should.
Well, and maybe some helpful notes and footnotes and good stuff like that. Yep.
I like the New Living Translation too.
New Living Translation. Yep. And a lot of these have updates. Like there's also a New King James Version that you can get. The NIV, New International Version, it got an update in 2011, but just kept the name. I guess they weren't going to call it the New International Version. They just happened to update it. So if you buy one off the shelf now, it'll be the updated. It'll be the New International Version.
So like when there's an update, what does that generally do? That's a question I have, but we can wait until later for you to.
Yeah, that's a good question for now. And we'll hear this pattern coming up as we talk about other translations, as whatever committee or group of scholars or person that put that translation out, or like in some of these owns the copyright or something, and they have seen over the years, oh, you know what, that word here, this verse, it could be a little better, and maybe we've discovered through archaeology some earlier copies of books of the Bible, and that's going to inform maybe some of the different words or phrases we choose in our translation. And just as like we don't speak today the same way that adults spoke in the 1920s or the 1850s, so especially over the decades, they'll kind of update the language to be more just natural to read. So it's also some of that as well. Okay, well, remember all these, because in a minute, I'm going to pass out a chart that shows generally how they compare with each other. And before we talk about any these are all in English, obviously. So before we talk about any English translation, let's remind ourselves that originally the Old Testament was written in the language Hebrew, and the New Testament was written in the language Greek. So every translation of the Bible, by definition, changes what the words were, because we can't read Greek, we can't read Hebrew. So to make a translation, you have to take what the meaning of those Greek and Hebrew words were and decide on what a good English word would be if you're making an English translation, or if you're making a Spanish translation or a Slovak translation. What's a good word to use based on those manuscripts? So the two big questions in Bible translations are, who does the translating, like who makes the decisions on what are the best words in our language that express those ancient words, and how do they approach that task of translating. And in a minute, we're going to talk about little different kinds of approaches to translating the original languages. Who does the translating decisions, and how do they approach their task? So, as a visual aid, a kind of show and tell, I'm going to pass out some Bibles, and you don't have to spend a lot of time looking at them, but just to kind of give you something to be thinking about as we talk about translations. So this one is the Old Testament in Hebrew, and remember, Hebrew is read from right to left. So if you want to start at the beginning, you have to start on the right side of the book, the table of contents. Looks like it's on the last page, but in Hebrew, it's the first page. So this is the Old Testament in its original language, and this is a New Testament in Greek, and you can kind of flip through, and some of the letters look like letters that we know, and some of them kind of don't, but this would be the original language of the New Testament. And then here's a Bible in Spanish, so just flip through and look at it and think about, people who were fluent in Spanish decided what words to choose based on the original language. And Sarah, I'm glad you're here tonight. One, because it's always good to see you. And two, so the Reina Valera version, remind me.
King James Version.
So this Spanish Bible is a translation into Spanish from our English King James. Okay? So that's interesting. That means they didn't have a copy of Greek and Hebrew on their desks when they made this. They had a copy of the King James Bible in English on their desk, and they translated that into Spanish. And so it's good to know, and we can decide, how helpful and how that informs our reading. And this was the only other language Bible I had in my office. When I went to Slovakia on a mission trip, I didn't want to leave without getting a Slovak Bible. So people fluent in Slovak and biblical languages had to sit down and decide which words would be good to describe what the writers were trying to express. So just kind of take these and just kind of pass them around and look at them and think about them.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Like the Slovak Bible, for example, is that a translation from the Greek and Hebrew?
That's
or
a good
is that
question,
a translation
Yes.
from English?
That's a very good question, and I tried to look. It doesn't have a lot of information in the
History of
front,
the translation.
and it's in Slovak. And I thought about.
You need to polish it.
I know how to say hello, goodbye, and I don't speak Slovak. But that's a great question. What's that?
Good.
And good, dobre. Oh no, right. So that's the perfect question, Brad, and that is the question when you see a Bible in another language. Where did they get their source material from? Yeah. So just pass around, just kind of look at them, and or not. Just kind of be thinking about, somebody or somebodies made the decision about what words to choose to express from the original languages. Now, the earliest times that any of the Bible was translated out of its original language was when, kind of during New Testament times or so, when the Old Testament, originally Hebrew, was translated into Greek, because as the centuries went by, more people spoke Greek than the ancient Old Hebrew language. And Greek was a very commonly used language around that part of the world. Then eventually, as more time went on, both testaments were translated into other languages so that more people could read them. And by the 300s AD, more people could read Latin than they could Greek. And by more people, we mean scholars, past ministers, the educated elite, not the kind of normal folks. But those educated leaders and church leaders more could read Latin than they could Greek. So that was the best language to then translate the Bible into at that point. And if you want to think about what was the first time that the Bible was translated, all the books of the Bible, kind of concisely, was translated into a version for lots of people to use as a Bible? The answer is a man named Jerome, and because of his contribution, the Catholic Church named him a saint, so you might hear Saint Jerome. And he was considered the most serious student of the Bible at the time. So in the year 382 AD, one of the church's leaders asked Jerome to take the newly established list of Bible books. And remember last week we talked about when finally the church said, okay, these books are in the Bible, New Testament, and these books are in the Bible, Old Testament. It took them a while to decide which ones would be considered the Holy Scriptures book. So after the list was kind of established, Jerome translated them from their original languages into Latin as kind of the first official kind of single Bible intended to give to churches or scholars. And of course, since then, the Bible's been translated into not just thousands of languages around the world, Spanish, Slovak, etc., but in each of those languages, many different kinds of translations. There's not just one translation in English, obviously. So, let me pass out a chart that kind of compares what different translations are like and gives you kind of a spectrum to compare them. Because, you're, okay. We're going to
So Stuart,
Yes.
just so I'm making that clear, because I was looking at the Slovak Bible
Yes.
and listening to you. So the world wrote in Greek, or at least that part of the world where Christianity began, spoke and wrote in Greek. And then by 382 AD, it was more common that scholars worked and spoke in Latin.
Yeah.
Okay.
More of them knew Latin, and Greek was just getting a little older, more ancient,
Okay.
more, history manuscripts, and Latin was more of a common tongue
Okay.
at that point. Yeah.
Both in speaking and in,
I don't know about speaking, but definitely like the educated class
Okay.
and the church leaders. and
thank
stuff.
you.
Yeah. Yeah.
English came along quite a bit later than that.
Yes, and then the English language has been evolving for 1,500 years. Oh, Sarah, can I have one? I didn't. There was, a version of Old English when the Angles and Saxons conquered England in 500, and then the Normans brought in some French, and so the English language has been evolving over the years. So Shakespeare, we can understand mostly, but there's some funky words. And if you go back earlier, you read like the original Canterbury Tales, Geoffrey Chaucer writing in Middle English. You might recognize some words or two, but it sounds kind of weird. So yeah, as time went on, the English language itself would evolve and change. And so Bibles translated into the way English was spoken at different times would also change. And we'll talk about that in a second.
I have a question, and
Yep.
it's probably really dumb.
No.
I looked at every one of the Bibles, and all the numbers are the same. So are numbers the same, over the world?
Chapter and verse? That's a really good question. They are the same in ours, in modern translations in other languages, yes. But I don't know when those were set and who set them. Because somebody would have had to have decided at some point, because the originals didn't have any, like we saw last week. That's a great question, and now my curiosity has been piqued, and I'll get back to you next week. Yeah.
I think the Hebrew Old Testament was slightly different numbered.
Yes.
I think they get one off somewhere in Genesis, and I think it kind of carries somewhere.
Yes. And in that Hebrew Bible that's going around, the numbers don't quite match our numbers there might be one or two or something off. Yeah, that's a great question. So look at the chart and you'll see that there are different approaches to publishing a Bible today. And kind of the two ways to think would be, is it a translation of the original languages, or is it more of a paraphrase of the original languages? And if it's a translation, is it more of an exact word for word? Or is it a little more of a, what's the thought that the original languages had, and we'll translate thought for thought? And all of these approaches kind of have their benefits, different kinds of benefits. One thing to remember is that if you think about some translations as being a word for word translation from the original language, it's not really, because in Greek and Hebrew they have different sentence structures and different kinds of verb tenses and conjugations that English doesn't even have. So in English we have subject, verb, object. I throw the ball, I read the book. Hebrew and Greek, like the word order is different. So if you tried to do an exact word for word, it would look total gibberish, like they didn't know how English worked. So you still, even if you're trying to take this Greek word and this Greek word, you still have to move them around to make a readable English sentence. And you still have to recognize that some words can have multiple meanings. Like in English, some of our English words, they can mean this, or they can mean that. So you still have to think about it, even word for word. The question? Okay, so even the word for word translations, you still have to do work in figuring out, well, what's the meaning of this word here, or this word here? Now, translations can come usually in this area. It's more likely to be a group or a committee of Bible scholars, and maybe a denomination might gather all of their brightest minds to work on this. And sometimes paraphrases can be maybe just one person or a few peoples who try and give their inspiring take on it. Like The Message is a paraphrase. I say translation because he's translated the originals, but Eugene Peterson is fluent in Greek and Hebrew, and he put together The Message based on his translation and paraphrase. So some of the paraphrases are not quite as exactly this word here, that word here, this word here, that word there. But that means that some of the paraphrases are even more readable and just kind of naturally English understandable, and some on this end of the spectrum cannot flow as well when you read them. And you can see on the spectrum kind of where they fall. Take like the NIV compared to the NRSV. They're very, very close, but I can tell that the NIV is a little more smoothly readable as far as the words that they choose than the NRSV. The NRSV sounds a little more kind of like a higher level of vocabulary. And our Pew Bibles are NRSV, and they're saying the same thing, but English has synonyms, and you can choose different synonyms. And next week we'll really open these different translations and look at some verses and say, oh, the NRSV chose this word, and the NIV chose this word. And usually the NRSV, like the reading level might be a little higher, like a 7th grade reading level versus a 6th grade reading level or something like that. So that's kind of why when I read from a Bible, like from the pulpit, or just read it, if I can only use one, I'll kind of use the NIV because it is kind of in the middle. It's a good combination of readability, and you can rely on it's a reliable translation, to say. Yeah. Now, like I said, paraphrases oftentimes will come maybe from one person, kind of giving their flourish to a translated Bible. And another Bible version that really is connected to one person, that's kind of the most famous Bible version out there, is the King James version of the Bible. At least in America and England, that's kind of the most famous. And it has its source in one person, King James, the king, the monarch at the time in the early 1600s. Now, he didn't do the translating. He wasn't a Bible scholar. He was just the king. But he gave strict instructions to the best Bible scholars in England to put out a new translation that would better reflect the structure and the words and verbiage that the Church of England was using at the time, so that their new translation would reflect better the way that the Church of England talked and spoke and set up their kind of priestly hierarchy. And he wanted to make sure that Puritans didn't have any influence in this new translation, because those darn Puritans were causing all kinds of trouble and getting all upset in England at the time. So the Bible scholars that King James had hired and ordered, commanded to translate this new version, they took already existing English versions, because there was already English translations of the Bible that had been used at the time. They were called like the Bishop's Bible or the Geneva Bible. This was in, 1600-ish, and there were definitely English translations for people who only spoke and read English that had already existed for many, many decades. So the scholars took those translations and kind of reworked them and rejiggered them, and they consulted the original languages based on the manuscripts that they had available. And we talked last week about some copies are older than other copies, and so when there's differences, you kind of have to weigh. So the King James translators, they used the existing English. They consulted the manuscripts that they had at the time. And in England, the King James Version is called the Authorized Version, because that is the one authorized version of the Bible, because the king commissioned it, and at the time, none other versions were allowed. So if you ever hear the Authorized Version, that's what they call King James Version. It was published in the year 1611. They worked on it for a few years and published it. The actual King James translation does include the Apocrypha, those books that kind of were included in the Bible. Some denominations and churches didn't think they should have been included, but others did, or they put them in a special section. Most of the Bibles that we have and that we buy off the shelf don't include those separate books. But the King James Version did, because they were widely used and read at the time. Yeah, because
Do you think they used in their thinking as a core logic?
Logic? They would have said yeah.
And then you'd have arguments, but you'd take it down to the fine points.
Yeah. They would have consulted the best sources they had at the time, which have been other English translations and ancient manuscripts they had available. Yeah, and they would have worked really hard to put out a good version that pleased the king, or else, Now, if you remember a couple of years ago, I guess 2 or 3 years ago, when we were talking about Baptist beginnings and where Baptists came from, well, it was right around that time, coincidentally, when the King James Bible was being worked on and published, was the time that the Baptist movement was starting for the very first time. And it was that same King James who hunted down the first Baptists because they were breaking the law. The law was you could only be the Church of England. You could only be the church of the state. So these early Baptists were breaking the law. King James imprisoned as many Baptists as he could capture. And there were 2 founders kind of all Baptists, John Smith and Thomas Helwys. King James was able to capture Thomas Helwys and had him executed. So ironically, if there's one person who really hated Baptists, it was King James. And it's ironic because today, naturally, many Baptist churches, we enjoy reading the King James translation, and yet King James hated Baptists. But when I was a kid in Bible drill and sword drill, that's how we memorized all the verses. So usually when I will quote a Bible verse, I'll kind of revert back to that King James translation, which I hope it makes King James roll over in his grave, knowing that so many Baptists are just loving his translation that he made for us. So as we know, because it was the authorized version in England, it was and became and still is one of the most popular, because at the time the king forced everybody to use that one and only that one. And as the decades went by, like we were talking about earlier, scholars learned that they maybe could translate words a little better. So newer editions of the King James translation were put out as the years and as the decades went by. As printing technology improved, they were able to kind of churn out a lot more massive quantities of King James versions quickly. But because there was so much being printed out so quickly, those early editions, back before there was kind of machines, when the earliest kind of typesetters had to pick each letter and then kind of press each page, they were done by human hands. And sometimes they would make mistakes and then still print the Bible and print thousands of copies. So some of those are funny mistakes. In the year 1631 edition, as they would update the King James translation pretty regularly. And in 1631, they put out an edition that, unfortunately, in Exodus 20:14, it said, "Thou shalt commit adultery." It's like the one letter you don't want to switch by accident. Or maybe it wasn't an accident. I don't know. Maybe that printer had something he was trying to justify. All the printers were heavily fined for their mistake, and later that edition was referred to as the Wicked Bible, because there was different editions of the King James Version. That was called the Wicked Bible because it said, thou shalt commit adultery. In the 1682 edition of King James referred to the parable of the vinegar instead of the parable of the vineyard. I guess the typesetter, sometimes when I'm typing, I'll type a word that's kind of like the word I mean, but it's definitely not the word I mean. So maybe the typesetter, when he was putting in the letters, he was meaning to put vineyard and just kind of got started, and the parable of the vinegar made its debut. So when that edition is referred to, it's called the Vinegar Bible, because that's the weird thing in it. The 1795 edition of the King James translation did not have Jesus telling his followers, "Let the children first be filled," like Mark 7:27 is supposed to say. Instead, the 1795 edition printed Jesus saying, "Let the children first be killed." Oh, really bad mistake. Like the one letter you don't want to make that mistake on. But interesting to see and track that over the years, even as we talked about now, editions and translations will update themselves, and if they notice, like, oops, we made an oops, we better fix that or update this. Same thing. Things that were in the King James that were changed in later totally different Bible translations. If you're interested, there are 8 references to unicorns in the King James, and there are 2 references to dragons in the King James. And in most other Bible translations that came along later and had access to newly discovered older manuscripts, there are 16 verses in the New Testament alone that are in the King James but are not in other Bible translations. And next week, so we're getting low on time, next week I'll give a handout that lists all the 16 verses that you can read in the King James, but if you open like the NIV or NRSV, it'll skip that number. And it'll skip from like 9, 10, 11, 13, 14. And you don't notice if you're kind of going through, but because the numbers by then had gotten settled, later translations realized, oh, that verse isn't in the oldest copies of these Bible books. And like we talked about last week, what do you do? What do you do when you discover older copies of Bible books that are a little different than the ones you've been translating? So a lot of times they'll put that in the footnote. The footnote will say, other Bible translations include a verse 12 that says this.
Are any of those verses that are either omitted or worked around, are they of any consequence from a
Like a theological reason or
sense.
justification?
Right.
Not too much that I know, and next week I'll give you that list, and we can check and we can see. But I don't think the main one that I know about, as far as we found older copies and it didn't have these verses, is like the ending of Mark that we talked about last week, that says you can handle snakes, poisonous snakes, and not be hurt. That's one that has had some ramifications, and I don't think these do. But I'll pass out a list, and next week we're going to really open it up and kind of look at the details. So remember that, and we'll check. Let's see. The whole time we've been talking about English translations, but like I said, there are thousands of translations in thousands of languages with different versions in each language. Like in Spanish, you can get kind of the King James Version, the NIV version, and if you go to the website Bible Gateway, it's a really helpful website. You can just type in any verse or book or chapter, and you can pick which translation you want to read it in, which language. If you want to do King James or New International, NRSV, Spanish, there's lots of Spanish options, Vietnamese, pretty much every language translation. Or if you get an app, usually Bible apps will have all those interesting options to look at. So, I think, imagine trying to take that original Greek and original Hebrew and having to figure out how to translate those words into a language that uses symbols and not letters, like Chinese. They don't really have letters. They just have pictures as the word. And the work involved would just be really interesting, but also hard, to read this Greek and go, okay, I think it means these kind of picture words. Other Asian languages, I think, would be really interesting and hard to decide how best to describe what the old text were saying. So, to wrap up, let's think about what's the best Bible translation to use. Number one answer, it's facetious, it's a little silly. None of them. The best to use is to learn Greek and learn Hebrew and read them yourself. Just like the original writers intended. Okay? Then you're not beholden to somebody else somewhere who decided to translate stuff. Okay. Now, that's silly. But Bill Gibson told me last week a really good saying that the best translation is the one you make yourself, which still you have to learn Hebrew and Greek. But then you're the one learning about what the words mean, reading the sentence, thinking about what it means, and you do your work and research to translate that original language into your language, that the meaning is the closest to you. Because I talk a little different than my wife talks, and June talks a little different than Cosette talks, So I like, Bill, what you said last week. The best translation is the one you make. Now, I don't know about you, I don't have time to learn Greek and Hebrew. I took it in seminary, it was really interesting. I forgot a lot of it, so I would need a lot of refresher course. Okay, so what's the answer to the question, best Bible translation to use? And the real answer is lots of them. Lots of them. Don't just pick one, but kind of look at that spectrum and kind of see where different ones fall on comparisons, and pick a few. Like, say you've got this scripture passage, maybe I'm going to preach on Sunday, you're going to read in Sunday school on Sunday, and get an NIV, get a King James, get the Message, get the Living Bible, get New American Standard, and read them in each one, and note, oh, they use this word, that's interesting. How does that flavor, how does that color the meaning? And because they were each translated by human people, and either groups of scholars or one person or two people. So get all those translations and let it inform you to get, kind of like I said last week, to get with all those different angles of insight to paint a more truer picture of the real meaning at the core. So that's the real answer. What's the best translation to use? Lots of them. I encourage you this week to pick a passage, or if you read a Bible verse in the morning, read it and pick a few translations. Go to BibleGateway.com. It's really easy, and you can just read a passage or a verse and just click and change and even compare different translations and let the different angles of understanding inform and expand and enrich your understanding of each verse in the Bible. So, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. And next week, we'll open our English Bibles and really compare different word choices and different differences.